The first time I saw the water rising, I thought it was just rain. But then, I saw my lawn chairs floating past my window, the tents, the coolers, the neighbors screaming in the water, and at the center of it all, the HOA president, smiling like she had won. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident, it was a plan. And what happened next changed the entire neighborhood forever. Welcome back to HOA Chaos. My name is Daniel. I'm a homeowner in a quiet American suburb. I work a regular office job, pay my bills, mow my lawn every Saturday. I never thought my biggest problem would be my own HOA board. But here in our neighborhood, the HOA doesn't just make rules, they play games. And this time, the game flooded my yard. I never asked for trouble, I only wanted peace, a quiet home, a normal life. But when the HOA looked at my yard, they saw something else. They saw a pool. At first, I didn't believe it. It sounded too crazy. Who would ever think flooding someone's yard was a community improvement? But with the HOA, nothing surprises me anymore. They always find new ways to control us. One month it's the mailbox height, the next month it's the color of your grass. Then suddenly, it's the size of your welcome mat. If it doesn't fit their little picture-perfect world, they come for you. So when they smiled and said, "Congratulations, Daniel, your yard is the new pool," I thought they were joking. But the next morning, I opened my curtains and saw water pouring in. At first, it was only a few inches, like a puddle after heavy rain. But then, it rose fast, the soil turned soft, the grass disappeared, and my yard became brown water. Stretching from fence to fence, I ran outside. My shoes sank deep into mud. My heart was racing across the street. Neighbors stood watching, some whispering, some pointing. And on the sidewalk, the HOA president herself, standing with her clipboard, nodding like she was. As proud of her work, I shouted at her, "What the hell is this?" She smiled, not with her eyes, just her lips, and she said, "Community project." Community project. That's what she called destroying my yard. That's what she called turning my home into a swamp. But here's the thing, the HOA doesn't just break you with rules, they break you with fines. So that same afternoon, I got a letter taped to my door. It said I owed $500 for unauthorized water storage. Yes, you heard me right. They flooded my yard, and then fined me for it. I laughed. I actually laughed, because it felt unreal, like some twisted joke you only hear in stories. But this was real, too real, and worse. It was only the beginning. Because when night fell, I heard voices outside. I looked out my window and saw shadows moving in the water. Kids from the neighborhood, splashing, laughing, swimming in my yard. One of them shouted, "Best pool ever." Another one threw an inflatable ring into the muddy water. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But I just stood there, frozen, watching strangers treat my misery like their fun. By the next morning, it got even worse. A whole group of people were there. Not just kids, families, parents with coolers, couples with floaties, even someone with a grill set up on the curb. They were treating my home like a public pool. And you know what the HOA president did? She walked right into the middle of it, waving like a queen, shaking hands, welcoming everyone, she said. This is exactly what our neighborhood needed. My blood boiled because she wasn't just destroying my yard. She was using it to make herself look powerful. But I wasn't ready to fight her. Not yet. Because deep down, I was scared. What if they took my house? What if they sued me into nothing? I had seen them do it before, to others, the quiet neighbor at the end of the street, the single mom 2 houses down, both gone, after our fighting the board. So I stayed quiet for a while, but every time I looked outside, I saw my home disappearing, my garden gone, my flowers drowned, even the tree I planted when I first moved in. Now standing in the middle of a filthy pool, and every splash, every laugh, every cheer was like a nail in my chest, I told myself. Maybe it would pass, maybe they would get bored, but they didn't. It grew bigger, louder, messier. Every day more people came, and every day, my yard turned into a circus. The worst moment? When I saw a stranger's dog swimming in what used to be my driveway, that was it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't take it anymore. Something inside me snapped. I looked at that dog, at the people, at the president smiling in her chair, and I thought, if they want a pool, then I'll give them one. Not just a pool, but a party they will never forget. I went inside, sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and started typing. HOA pool party tonight. Everyone welcome. I posted it everywhere. Facebook groups, Craigslist, even a flyer at the gas station. I didn't care who came. I wanted chaos. I wanted them to see what happens when you push a man too far. By evening, I heard the music. Cars lined the street. People I had never seen before poured in. Teenagers with speakers, families with kids, even bikers with beer. It was wild, loud, unstoppable. I stood at my window, watching the storm I had created, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The first car pulled up at sunset, and then another, and another. My quiet street, once so still you could hear the sprinklers at night, was now filled with headlights, engines rumbling, strangers stepping out with towels around their necks and coolers in their hands. I leaned against the window frame, watching them march into my yard. It felt unreal, like I had opened a door to chaos, and chaos had accepted the invitation. The first group were teenagers, blasting music from a speaker, dancing before they even touched the water. Then came families, kids running with inflatable tubes, parents laughing like this was a summer festival. One guy even brought a giant swan floaty, dragging it across my lawn and tossing it into the muddy water like it was a real pool. The HOA president saw it all. She came out of her house, clutching her wine glass, her mouth wide open. At first she looked proud, like this was her idea, but as the crowd grew louder, messier, bigger, I saw her smile twist into something else, something colder, something furious. She tried to control it. She stepped onto the curb, raised her voice, and shouted, "This is a private community event. Only members are allowed." But no one listened. The music drowned her voice. The laughter swallowed her anger. And me? I just sat on my porch chair, watching the queen lose her crown. Soon the smell of barbecue filled the air. Someone had dragged out a grill. Smoke rose high, mixing with the sound of splashing water and blasting music. Cars kept pulling up, people pouring in. What started as 20 people became 50. What started as a neighborhood joke became a full-blown party. Kids jumped from my fence into the water. Men cracked open beers. A woman in a red bikini climbed onto a floaty and posed for selfies. Even a local DJ showed up, setting up his table on the sidewalk and spinning tracks that shook the street. It was madness, madness in my yard, and every second of it. I loved the HOA president didn't. She stormed back into her house. Moments later, 2 other board members joined her on the street, clipboards in hand, faces red with rage. They tried to hand out fines. They tried to scream rules into the crowd, but people laughed in their faces. One guy grabbed a fine notice, rolled it into a ball, and tossed it into the water like trash. The whole crowd cheered. The board had no power now. Not heat. Air. Not tonight. The party grew louder, wilder. Someone brought fireworks. They lit the sky with colors. Reflections danced on the water in my yard. Children screamed in joy. Adults shouted in excitement. For one night, my misery turned into freedom. But deep inside, I knew this wouldn't last. The HOA wouldn't just accept defeat. They would strike back. And when they did, it would be brutal. Around midnight, I saw flashing lights. Not fireworks this time. Police cars, 3 of them. Sirens cut through the music. The crowd froze for a second, before some people scattered, but most stayed, because the police didn't come for them. They came for me. "Sir, are you the homeowner?" one officer asked. I nodded. My stomach dropped, but I stood tall. "This gathering is out of control," he said. "The HOA has filed a complaint." I looked at him, then pointed at the water. "Does that look like my fault?" I asked. The officer turned his head, saw the flooded yard, saw the people swimming in what was once my garden. He didn't answer. He just sighed and shook his head. The HOA president stormed over, waving her arms. "Arrest him!" she shouted. "He's violating community rules." But the officer raised his hand. "Ma'am, this is not a criminal matter." She turned red, furious, powerless. The police stayed for a while, making sure the chaos didn't turn into disaster. But they didn't shut it down, not completely. And when they left, the party came back even louder. By 2 a.m., my yard looked like a battlefield, cups floating in the water, food wrappers stuck in the mud, coolers half sunk, and people still dancing, still laughing. The HOA president had vanished into her house, her windows closed, her lights off. She was defeated. For now, I leaned back on my porch, watching the last of the fireworks fade, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: victory. It wasn't clean, it wasn't pretty, but it was mine. Of course, I knew tomorrow would be different. The HOA would regroup. They would plot their revenge. Letters, fines, threats, maybe even lawyers. But tonight I won, and every splash in that filthy water, every laugh, every beat of the music was proof that the HOA wasn't invincible. They could be mocked, they could be beaten, and all it took was one pool party. The sun started to rise, the crowd thinned, cars left one by one, the music faded. By morning, my yard was empty again, empty but ruined. Trash everywhere, mud deeper than before, chairs floating upside down. I should have felt regret, but I didn't. I only felt calm, because for once, I had turned their power against them. I had used their own pool, their own rules, to humiliate them. And that's when the real thought hit me. If I could do this once, what else could I do? The morning after the party, my street looked like a war zone. Cups floated in the brown water, empty bottles clinked against my fence, a forgotten flip-flop bobbed up and down in the mud, and the smell, smoky barbecue mixed with dirty water. Heavy in the air, I should have been tired, but I wasn't. I barely slept. Yet my body buzzed with energy because I knew what the HOA would do next. They weren't going to forgive this. They weren't going to forget this. Sure enough, at 9 a.m. sharp, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, 3 board members stood there, the president in the middle, her lipstick too bright, her eyes sharper than knives. On her left, the treasurer, holding a fat binder. On her right, the secretary clutching a clipboard like it was her weapon. They didn't even say good morning. The president pushed a thick envelope into my chest and hissed, "You're finished." I took it inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and pulled out the papers. A notice of violation, a demand for immediate payment, total fines, $14,750. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was insane. The list was long. Unauthorized pool use, noise violation, public indecency, unauthorized community event, improper waste disposal, and the best one, failure to control guests. I didn't even know that was a rule. They fined me for every firework, every beer can, every floaty left behind. It was like they had turned last night's fun into a receipt of destruction, and at the bottom, in bold red letters, if fines are not paid in full within 14 days, legal action will begin, including potential foreclosure. Foreclosure. They were threatening to take my house. I sat there, staring at the paper, the laughter from the night before still ringing in my head. And suddenly it felt heavy, too heavy. The HOA didn't need guns. They didn't need fists. Their weapon was paperwork, and right now, they were aiming it straight at me. I spent the day pacing. Every knock on the door made me jump. Every car that slowed near my house felt like a spy. The party had been fun. But now, reality hit. This wasn't over. This was war. By evening, I made a choice. I wasn't going to hide. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. I called my friend Mike. He used to be a lawyer, not the fancy kind, but smart enough to know HOA tricks. When I told him what happened, he laughed so hard he almost choked. "They fined you for guests?" he said. "That's not even legal." He came over with his laptop. We spread the papers across my table, and we started reading every single line. That's when we saw it, buried in their own bylaws. A tiny sentence, written years ago. It said the HOA could not alter a homeowner's property without written consent. Consent. I never gave. Consent they faked. Mike leaned back and grinned. They flooded your yard without permission. And now they're fining you for it. This could destroy them. For the first time all day, I felt hope. But hope wasn't enough. I wanted revenge, the kind of revenge they would never forget. So I called the local news. I told them everything: the flood, the fines, the party. At first they didn't believe me, until I sent them pictures. Pictures of strangers swimming in my yard, pictures of my garden underwater, pictures of the president sipping wine while kids floated by. Within hours, a reporter showed up at my door, camera in hand, microphone ready. I stood in my driveway, mud around my shoes, and told my story. By the next morning, it was everywhere. HOA turns man's yard into pool. Homeowner fights, back with party. Suburban chaos floods neighborhood. The comments online were brutal. Some people laughed at the HOA. Some cursed them. Some even offered to start a fundraiser for me, but the president? She was furious. She stormed into my yard, cameras rolling, screaming that I was lying. But every word out of her mouth only made her look worse, and the cameras loved it. That week, I became the talk of the town. People I had never met before stopped me at the grocery store. "Hey, aren't you the pool guy? Loved your party, man." Some even asked when the next one was. The HOA board, though. They went silent. No more knocks on my door, no more letters. For now, but I could feel it. They were planning something bigger, something nastier, because the HOA doesn't forgive. The HOA doesn't forget. The HOA waits, and then it strikes. So every night, I sat on my porch, watching the empty yard, smelling the mud, hearing the silence that felt heavier than noise. And I wondered, what would they do next? Would they drag me to court? Would they raise everyone's fees to punish me? Would they try to make me the villain? One thing I knew for sure: this fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. Everyone who ever got fined for a mailbox, everyone who ever got threatened for a flower pot, everyone who lived in fear of their own neighborhood. The board thought they could drown me in paper. But I had something stronger: the truth, the crowd, the story. And I wasn't going to let it go. The silence didn't last long. 1 week after the news story broke, another envelope appeared on my door. This one wasn't taped by hand. Tea was delivered by a man in a suit. Official, cold, heavy. Inside was the worst thing I could imagine: a lawsuit. The HOA was suing me for damages. They accused me of defamation, reckless endangerment, even tarnishing community reputation. And the number at the bottom: $500,000, $500,000. For telling the truth, I sat at my table, staring at the papers. My hands shook. This wasn't a fine I could ignore. This was war, written in black ink on legal paper. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow outside my window felt like the HOA watching me. Every creak in the house felt like a warning, and I kept asking myself, had I gone too far? But then, I remembered their smile the day they flooded my yard, their smug faces as they fined me for their own mess, their laughter behind closed doors, and I knew. I couldn't back down. Mike, my lawyer friend, came back the next day. He read the lawsuit slowly, carefully, and when he finished, he chuckled. "They're bluffing," he said. "They think if they scare you big enough, you'll crawl away." But I wasn't crawling anymore. We filed a counterclaim. We pointed to their own bylaws. We showed the photos, the videos, the news clips. Every piece of evidence painted them not as protectors, but as bullies drowning in their own lies. Still, the waiting was torture. Weeks passed, court dates loomed on the calendar, and in the meantime, the HOA turned up their psychological games. Notes started appearing on my car. "Sell your house before it's too late. Your neighbors hate you." One even said, "We'll drain you dry." Late at night, I'd hear knocks on my door, but when I opened it, no one was there. Lights flickered in my yard. Trash showed up on my driveway. It was like living in a haunted house, except the ghosts wore polo shirts and sat on the board. The worst part? Some neighbors turned against me. People who once cheered at the party now avoided me. Some even whispered that I had brought shame to the street, that my fight was selfish, that I was hurting property values. I realized something. Then, the HOA didn't need everyone on their side. They only needed fear. Fear kept people quiet. Fear kept people in line. Fear made me their target, while everyone else stayed safe. But fear can break too, because one night, as I was dragging my trash can to the curb, Mrs. Ellis, my elderly neighbor, walked over. She was small, fragile, always quiet, but this time her voice shook with anger. "They fined me $200 last week," she whispered, "for planting roses too close to the sidewalk." Her hands trembled as she held out a crumpled letter. I read it. Cold words, empty threats. It was the same paper weapon they used on me, and in that moment, I saw it, the truth. The HOA wasn't powerful because they were smart. They were powerful because no one stood together, so I made a decision. If they wanted to drag me into court, fine. But I wasn't going alone. I printed flyers, simple words, bold letters. Have you been fined? Have you been threatened? Have you been silenced? Join me. I slipped them under doors. I taped them to mailboxes. I handed them out at the grocery store. And slowly, people started to come forward. The single mom they nearly evicted for a broken fence. The retired veteran they fined for parking his truck in his own driveway. The quiet family whose kids were banned from riding bikes on the sidewalk, one by one. Stories spilled out. Pain, anger, humiliation, and together, we weren't just neighbors anymore. We were witnesses. By the time our first court hearing came, we weren't standing alone. We were an army. The courtroom was packed. The HOA board sat on one side, stiff suits, fake smiles. I sat on the other, surrounded by neighbors who finally broke their silence. The judge listened as lawyers argued. The HOA painted me as a reckless troublemaker. They called the pool party a dangerous stunt. They said I had ruined the community's image. But then, witness after witness stood up, and every story was worse than mine. Fines for absurd reasons, threats mailed at midnight, rules twisted until people broke. Even tears. Real tears from people who had lost savings because of the board's greed. The judge's face grew colder with every word. The HOA president's smile cracked, and when it was my turn, I stood tall. "My yard was never a pool," I said. "They made it one." And when I fought back, they tried to drown me in paper. But this isn't about me anymore. This is about everyone who lives in fear of them. The room was silent, every eye on me, every breath held. And in that silence, I knew the tide had turned. The case wasn't over yet, but the cracks in their power were showing. And once cracks appear, walls collapse. I walked out of that courtroom into the sunlight. Neighbors clapped my back. Some smiled for the first time in months. Even Mrs. Ellis squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time, I felt like we had a chance, not just to win, but to change everything. Walking out of the courthouse that day felt like victory. But victories in HOA wars never last long, because the next morning, another envelope landed on my doorstep. This one was thicker, heavier, and uglier than the rest. Inside were not fines, not warnings, but letters. Letters from my own neighbors, at least. That's what the board claimed. Each letter said the same thing, that I was destroying property values, causing chaos, hurting the community. Some even accused me of lying, of staging the entire pool party for attention. I knew some of these neighbors. I had waved to them for years, borrowed sugar, helped shovel snow, and now their words cut like knives. But when I looked closer, I noticed something. The handwriting was the same. The signatures looked copied. The letters weren't from my neighbors. They were from the board. A smear campaign, an illusion of hate, all designed to break me down. I wanted to scream, to rip the letters to shreds. But instead, I saved them. Evidence. Because deep down, I knew something. Big was coming. Something darker than fines. Something worse than fake letters. And I was right. That week, the HOA called a special meeting. Flyers went out. Notices posted. Mandatory attendance for all residents. I almost didn't go, but I knew if I stayed home, they'd spin the story without me. So I walked into the community hall. The room was packed, chairs filled, people standing in the back, everyone whispering. At the front sat the board, the president in the center, smiling that cold smile, her eyes locked on me the second I entered. The meeting began with lies, slide after slide on the projector, proof that I had endangered children, proof that my pool party had cost thousands in damages, proof that I was tearing the neighborhood apart. Each proof was twisted, photos taken out of context, numbers inflated, rumors passed off as facts, and every time they showed a slide, The president would pause, look around the room, and then look at me like she was daring me to speak. Finally, I stood, my heart hammered in my chest. My voice shook at first, but then it grew steady. "You flooded my yard," I said. "You turned my home into a pool without consent. And when I fought back, you tried to silence me. But you can't hide the truth forever." The room buzzed. Whispers spread. People glanced at each other. Some nodded, some frowned. The board shifted uncomfortably. And then, a voice from the back, an older man, Mr. Johnson, who had lived here longer than anyone, he stood and said, "They fined me for hanging my flag last year. They said it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. I paid, because I was scared. But now, I'm not scared anymore." Another neighbor stood, then another, one by one. Voices rose, stories spilled, fines for tiny cracks in the sidewalk, warnings for improper lawn chairs, threats for leaving garage doors open too long. It was like the dam finally broke, and the flood wasn't water this time. It was truth. The board tried to shout over it. The president slammed her gavel. "Order! Order!" she screamed. But no one listened. The room belonged to us now. That night, something changed. The board realized they weren't untouchable anymore, but they weren't done fighting. They never stop. 2 days later, I woke up to find my tires slashed. Not one, not two, all four. No note, no witnesses. But I knew who did it. The next week, someone spray-painted "traitor" on my fence. Bright red letters dripping down the wood. Ugly, loud. But I left it there because I wanted the world to see what the board had become. The war wasn't just in court anymore. It was on my street. It was in my yard. It was in every shadow at night. But here's the thing. They thought fear would crush me. Instead, it fueled me. I doubled down. I met with neighbors in secret. We shared stories. We gathered documents. We built a file so thick it could bury the entire board. And then, we found it. The secret we had all been waiting for. The treasurer, the quiet man who never smiled, had been stealing money, thousands of dollars, hidden in fake maintenance fees, fake community improvement projects, fake repairs that never happened. The pool in my yard? It wasn't just abuse of power. It was a cover-up. Money had been funneled into it, money that vanished into the treasurer's pocket. When we discovered this, my hands shook, not with fear this time, with excitement, because now we had them. We turned the evidence over to the State Housing Authority. We turned copies over to the news, and we kept some for ourselves. The board didn't see it coming. The president kept barking orders. The secretary kept sending letters. But behind their backs, their walls were crumbling. Neighbors once silent now stood proud. People once scared now laughed. And for the first time in years, the board looked small. But I knew. Cornered animals fight hardest, and the board wasn't going to go down without claws. Not after years of ruling this neighborhood like kings and queens, the moment we uncovered the treasurer's secret. Eve, everything changed. What once felt like a hopeless battle suddenly felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. For years, the HOA had controlled us with rules, fines, and fear. But this was bigger than noise violations or mailbox heights. This was theft, real theft, and not just from me, but from everyone in the neighborhood. When I told my neighbors what we found, their faces lit up with anger. They weren't scared anymore. They were furious. The single mom clenched her fists. "They fined me for leaving a bike outside," she said, "all while stealing our money?" Mr. Johnson slammed his cane against the floor. "I paid fees for 10 years. They said it was for repairs, but nothing was ever fixed." Mrs. Ellis, the quiet old woman, her voice cracked but steady. "They bullied us. They scared us. But now, it's their turn to be afraid." For the first time, it wasn't just me standing against the board, it was all of us. We gathered every piece of proof, receipts, bank records, emails we dug up from old community files, even screenshots from the treasurer's careless messages. It was like building a bonfire, and we were ready to set it ablaze. The next court date was different. The board strutted in with their lawyers. But this time, we weren't nervous. We were smiling. When the judge entered, the board started their usual show, accusing me of being reckless, of endangering the community spirit, of being a troublemaker who cared more about chaos than neighbors. But then, our lawyer stood. He slid a thick folder across the table. "Your Honor," he said, "this isn't about noise complaints. This is about embezzlement." The judge raised his eyebrows, the board froze, and one by one, the documents were revealed, transactions that didn't match, invoices for fake projects, checks signed and cashed into private accounts, tens of thousands gone, and the biggest bombshell, a recent transfer to a personal bank account belonging to the treasurer himself. The courtroom went silent. You could hear the treasurer's breath, heavy, panicked. The president's smile vanished. The secretary dropped her pen. The moment we uncovered the treasurer's secret, everything changed. What once felt like a hopeless battle suddenly felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. For years, the HOA had controlled us with rules, fines, and fear. But this was bigger than noise violations or mailbox heights. This was theft, real theft. And not just from me, but from everyone in the neighborhood. When I told my neighbors what we found, their faces lit up with anger. They weren't scared anymore. They were furious. The single mom clenched her fists. "They fined me for leaving a bike outside," she said, "all while stealing our money?" Mr. Johnson slammed his cane against the floor. "I paid fees for 10 years. They said it was for repairs, but nothing was ever fixed." Mrs. Ellis, the quiet old woman, her voice cracked but steady. "They bullied us. They scared us. But now, it's their turn to be afraid." For the first time, it wasn't just me standing against the board. It was all of us. We gathered every piece of proof, receipts, bank records, emails we dug up from old community files, even screenshots from the treasurer's careless messages. It was like building a bonfire, and we were ready to set it ablaze. The next court date was different. The board strutted in with their lawyers. But this time, we weren't nervous. We were smiling. When the judge entered, the board started their usual show, accusing me of being reckless, of endangering the community spirit, of being a troublemaker who cared more about chaos than neighbors. But then, our lawyer stood. He slid a thick folder across the table. "Your Honor," he said, "this isn't about noise complaints. This is about embezzlement." The judge raised his eyebrows. The board froze, and one by one, the documents were revealed. Transactions that didn't match, invoices for fake projects, checks signed and cashed into private accounts, tens of thousands gone, and the biggest, bombshell, a recent transfer to a personal bank account belonging to the treasurer himself. The courtroom went silent. You could hear the treasurer's breath, heavy, panicked. The president's smile vanished. The secretary dropped her pen. The judge leaned forward. "Is this true?" he asked. The treasurer's face turned red. He stammered, denied. But the paper didn't lie. The evidence was clear. They had stolen from the very people they claimed to protect. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, outrage. Neighbors who once feared the board now shouted from the benches. "Thieves! Give us our money back. You ruined this neighborhood." The president tried to control it. She stood, her voice shaking. "This is a misunderstanding, a clerical error." The board was broken, but not destroyed. The treasurer had been exposed as a thief. The secretary was hiding. The neighbors had turned against them. But the president, she refused to fall. Even after the courtroom humiliation, even after the news reports, she walked the street like nothing had happened, clipboard in hand, smile on her lips, eyes sharp as glass. It was like she lived in her own reality, one where she was still queen, and the rest of us were just pawns, for a while. Things were quiet, too quiet. No more fines taped to my door. No more notes slipped under my windshield. No more late-night knocks. But silence in an HOA war is never peace. It's only the pause before the storm. And the storm came. One morning, I stepped outside to find a notice on every door, an emergency assessment. Every household owed $2,000 due immediately. Failure to pay would result in liens and foreclosures. Neighbors gathered on the street, clutching the letters, their voices shaking. "Is this even legal? They can't do this. They'll take our houses if we don't pay." I looked at the notice, and my chest burned with rage, because I knew exactly what this was. Not maintenance. See, not repairs. This was revenge, her last attempt to drain us dry before the ship sank. That night, I called another meeting, but this time, it wasn't in the community hall. It was in my yard. Dozens showed up, Mr. Johnson with his cane, Mrs. Ellis holding a folder of old fines. the single mom with her kids by her side, families, couples, even neighbors who had once stayed silent, all standing ankle-deep in the mud where the pool once was. I stood on the porch, the floodlights casting long shadows, and I said the words I had been waiting to say for months. It's time to take back our neighborhood. Cheers erupted, claps, shouts, for the first time. The fear was gone. We weren't victims anymore. We were fighters. Together we drafted a petition to recall the board, to strip them of power, to replace them with people who actually lived here, people we trusted. It spread fast, door to door, house to house, signatures piled up. Even the neighbors who once ignored me now signed with pride. And when we delivered it, the president's face turned white. She screamed, she threatened, she swore it would never work. But deep down, she knew the crown was slipping off her head. The final battle came at the recall meeting. The hall was packed again. But this time, the board sat small. Their numbers didn't matter. Their gavel didn't matter. The power was gone, one by one. Neighbors stood and read their stories aloud. The fines, the threats, the humiliation, the stolen money. The president tried to shout them down, but every word she spoke only dug her hole deeper. Her voice cracked, her face red, her smile gone, finally. The vote came. Hands rose in the air, one after another, row after row. The majority was clear. The board was finished. The treasurer resigned first. Silent and pale, the secretary slipped out the back, never to return, and the president. She stood frozen, her eyes darting from face to face like she couldn't believe the kingdom she built was gone. When she finally walked out, clipboard still in her hand. No one clapped, no one cheered. Just silence. The sound of power leaving the room that night. Ike walked home with my neighbors by my side for the first time. The street felt alive. Children rode their bikes freely. Flags waved on porches. Lawns grew wild without fear of fines. And my yard. Still a mess, still muddy, still scarred from months of chaos. But when I looked at it, I smiled. Because it wasn't just a yard anymore. It was proof. Proof that you could fight back. Proof that the HOA wasn't invincible. Proof that even the smallest rebellion could flood the whole system. Weeks later, a new board was elected. Not perfect people, but real neighbors. People who cared more about community than control. The first thing they did? Cancel every bogus fine, end the $2,000 assessment, and promise full transparency of every dollar. The neighborhood finally breathed again. And me? I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset over my messy yard, and I thought about everything we had been through. The water, the party, the court, the lies, the truth. I thought about how close I came to losing everything, and how somehow I walked away with something better, not just freedom, but unity. Because in the end, this wasn't just my story, it was everyone's story. Everyone who ever lived under an HOA's shadow, everyone who ever feared a fine for the wrong flower, or the wrong paint, or the wrong smile at the wrong time. And I realized, this fight wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Because as long as there are boards that abuse power, there will be people like me, people like us, ready to push back, ready to flood their rules with truth. And now I'll leave you with this. If your HOA collapsed tomorrow and the board resigned in disgrace, would you run for a spot to rebuild it the right way? Or would you let the neighborhood live free without an HOA at all? Tell me in the comments, which future would you choose?